Within every man exists these four archetypes. More specifically, these archetypes serve as the foundation for his psyche, and in particular, the masculine elements of his psyche. And those four archetypes are the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover. And it's how you are embodying these different archetypes and the characteristics that they represent in your life that will really determine how you're showing up as a man in the world, and whether you are showing up in your fullness and at the full masculine potential that you have within you, or if you're showing up in a more passive way, or even a more overactive way. So this would be the difference between the soy boy or the passive man and like the toxically masculine man. So let's start off with the king archetype. So the king archetype represents all the different forms of your leadership qualities, your clarity of vision, your ability to lead yourself and lead others. Think of Marcus Aurelius, for example. He is the prime example of the king archetype represented in its fullness. His ego isn't attached to being the leader and being the king, so he isn't a tyrannical leader, but he also is able to lead effectively. He's not a passive leader. He doesn't let things just fly. He was still very in control, a very stern, not stern, I wouldn't use the word stern, but he was very direct. But at the same time, he balanced that with this detachment from his ego. So he was able to lead effectively without becoming tyrannical. Now, what you'll see here are these branches off of each of the archetypes. And if you can see closely enough, we have a positive form and a negative form. What that means is that we have these sub-archetypes, which represent the king energy, as they refer to it, in its overactive position and in its passive position. So essentially, when you are allowing this archetype to take over your psyche and your ego, and when it's underrepresented, and when it's detached from your psyche or your ego. So like I mentioned, when the king, the leadership qualities of the king and the power that he possesses is overactive in the psyche of a man, he becomes tyrannical. This is the man who is dominating over his partner, over his kids, at work. He's not a great leader, and he attacks people rather than inspires them and leads them through positive reinforcement and motivation and inspiration. So again, the archetype here is represented in people like Adolf Hitler, right? And there are plenty of different examples of this throughout history. I'm not going to get into them here, but essentially this is when this leadership energy is bound to the ego and it's over attached to the ego. So if you are someone who identifies with your inner power as a leader and you allow that to consume your psyche, you will begin to represent this form of yourself in the form of a tyrannical leader, which is toxic and obviously not what you want in your life. On the passive side, we have the weak leader. This is the man who isn't able to stand up for what he believes in. He isn't able to stand his ground, have difficult conversations, and lead people in the way that they need to be led. He's the man who lets his wife walk all over him, his colleagues walk all over him. He allows people in his life to treat him like he is lesser than, and he isn't able to fully embody the power that he has within him to self-govern and to govern others and lead others. So this is the weak leader. Again, this is when the king energy is being misrepresented or underrepresented within the psyche of that man. Next up, we have the warrior. Now, if we think of the king as the leader, the warrior is essentially the one who takes action. He's unemotional in the sense that he's able to act without the consideration of feelings coming into play. So whether he's motivated or unmotivated, he will still act. He is a man who is very purpose-driven. So if you think about the king as the leader, you think about the warrior as serving a purpose outside of himself, whereas the king, to some degree, is serving the purpose of the people that he is leading, but also his own needs, right? Because the kingdom will ultimately fall back onto himself. So if the kingdom fails, he has failed, and so his needs are still somewhat self-centered. The warrior is different in the sense that he's actually focused on a purpose outside of himself. So he's serving the king's needs. He's trying to protect the kingdom itself. Obviously, I'm using these analogies, but essentially what this means is that the warrior is more purpose-led, and he's able to move and take action, and massive action at that, in a way that is aggressive without having the need for the motivation to be there, because the motivation is his why. It's the internal sense of purpose he feels to show up as a warrior. Now, if this warrior energy is overactive in the psyche of a man, it shows up as aggression. So this means that he's so detached from his emotions that he can begin to become aggressive with other people. So the aggression that he channels into taking energy starts to flow into his relationships. This is why a lot of high operating CEOs and high performing men tend to have crumbling relationships and families, because they're so over engaged in this warrior energy and this ability to take unemotional, massive, relentless, aggressive action, that it erodes their ability to empathize with the people around them, and they become emotionally detached. This is obviously not ideal. Now, on the other side of that, the passive side, the passive archetype, is when the warrior energy is underrepresented, and so the man becomes passive. So this essentially means that he becomes at the whim of his emotions, and he becomes weak. He becomes unable to channel that aggression into either taking action or just within his own life in any way, shape, or form. And so he becomes the effect of his life. He's no longer at the cause of life, where he is the cause that creates the effects in his life. He is simply at the effect, and life is just happening to him. He isn't able to change his circumstances. He takes the passive backseat in his own life. Moving on, we have the magician. Now, the magician is essentially the wisdom within you, the thinker, the philosopher, the part of you who has this niche information, especially if we're looking into more psychological, philosophical, or esoteric terms. This is the part of you that has this information that not everyone has access to. For example, even if you're an engineer or a medical doctor, like, you have these niche pieces of information that you can use to benefit other people and to benefit yourself. Now, this is essentially the part of you that is wise. It's not the part of you that is acting, right? That's the warrior. It's not the part of you that's governing yourself. That's the king. The magician is the part of you who is the philosopher, who is the intelligent, the part of you that is aware of all the different pieces of information that go into feeding back into the other elements to act and to make these decisions. This is the part of you that just is aware and has the knowledge and is intelligent, and especially when it comes to niche information that not everyone has access to. However, when it is overrepresented, it really channels the manipulator archetype, which is where you're using this information that you have for bad. Think about it in terms of a political sense, where we have, for example, Nazi Germany using their political powers to manipulate the population to believe their story. And they used intelligence stories to create this narrative that manipulated their entire population to aligning with their belief system. So this information can either be used for good or it can be used for evil and manipulation. And of course, when it is overrepresented in a way that it is now seen as an opportunity to be a vehicle for selfish gain, the manipulation or manipulator archetype will come through. On the other side, we have ignorance. So when you are underrepresenting the magician energy, the part of you who is curious, that is intellectual, that is inspired to learn things that other people don't yet understand or is very niche, you just become ignorant because you aren't learning, you aren't growing, you aren't curious. You have to have that psychological curiosity about you and that intellectual curiosity about you to really manifest the magician energy in its fullness. Now, finally, we have the lover. So the lover, again, if we have the leader, the actor, the thinker, this is the feeler. This is the part of you that is in touch with your emotions, that empathizes, that loves, that is really centered around feeling. Okay? Now, people might think that this isn't really an important element of a man's life, but the truth is that it is. Because a man detached from his emotions will just become the aggressive or overly aggressive warrior. And again, anger is an emotion. So the man who is locked into a hyper vigilant, angry, anxious, stressed out state is still an emotional man. Being able to actually be in touch with the lover side of you means that you can connect deeply with other people, that you can connect deeply with yourself and understand the underlying elements of your psyche and who you are as a person. It also means that you're able to experience the joys of life and not be detached emotionally from the things that happen to you. So of course, that means that you can feel both the highs and the lows of life much more deeply. Now, when it's overrepresented, this becomes the addicted archetype or the addiction, or it's represented as addiction. Okay, so think about this in literally any element of your life. If you become too enamored by the idea of pleasure and how you feel, you become addicted to food, right? Because you want to constantly feel good and feel comfortable. You become addicted to weed, again, for the same reasons. to cocaine, to alcohol, to having sex, and you become a sex addict or a porn addict. It's because you were over-identified with the part of you that is the feeling element of you, the part of you that wants to feel, the part of you that wants to feel pleasure and experience pleasure. On the other side, when it's underrepresented, you experience apathy. So you are detached from your ability to feel anything, feel the joys of life, feel love from other people, feel pleasure. Everything just takes on this gray color because, again, you're detached from the part of you that allows you to feel. So these are the 4 archetypes. And essentially, in order for you, if you are on any of these different elements of the overactive or passive poles of these archetypes, you have to look at where in your life you're demonstrating them. So where in your life are you tyrannical? Where in your life are you showing up as a weak leader? Because it could be different for other people, right? Maybe at work you're showing up as a weak leader, but at home you're showing up as tyrannical for your kids, for your partner, or for your wife, or whoever it may be. So you have to understand that there are different areas of your life that these different archetypes will display themselves and present themselves. And it's up to you to understand where they're presenting themselves, and how you bring them back to balance is, again, by looking at it like a scale. You're trying to keep the scale balanced in the center where you're fully embodying each archetype without allowing it to tip too far in the overactive or passive directions. So again, this would mean bringing down, if you're, sorry, I just hit the mic. If you're over-identified with the tyrannical leader within you, you have to disidentify your ego with your leadership ability. Because if your ego is too tied in with the awareness that you're a leader, then tyranny is just the byproduct of that. Because you are overly attached to that outcome and to that ideology and to that element of yourself and how you're perceived in the world. You think that that's too important as to how you perceive yourself. Now, the warrior, if you're overly demonstrating the warrior, you have to try and bring in more of the lover, and you have to try and reduce that aggression that you're experiencing in that area of your life. Especially, for example, if you're allowing your aggression within your work to take over, you have to try and actually bring back a bit more empathy into that element of the equation, especially if this is relating to family. With the magician, again, you have to have a constant desire to learn and to grow and to evolve your knowledge and your level of awareness. But again, you have to be using it while attached to the king energy so that you're able to use it for good, and actually use it with the warrior energy so that you can actually apply it, because information without application is just potential energy that goes wasted. So what you'll find here, as I'm going through this before I complete it with the lover, is that they're all integrated. All 4 of these archetypes are integrated with one another, and they work in synergy. And if one of them is underactive, then they will be misrepresented in all 3 other archetypes. So you have to empower all 3 of them to experience the wholeness of all. You have to empower all 4 of them in order to experience the wholeness of all 4 of them. Now, finally, the lover, again, if you are overly attached with feeling and with your love for pleasure, you have to start getting back into action and start reducing your need for pleasure. You have to start looking at the downsides of being so enamored by the need for pleasure and love and feeling and everything attached to that, essentially that archetype, right? And once you're able to become aware of where in your life you're demonstrating each of these different archetypes, in what areas of your life they're overactive, in what areas of your life they're underactive, then you can start to represent them all in their wholeness and ultimately become an entire, complete, and whole man who is living to his full masculine potential. Okay, hopefully that was valuable. If it was, subscribe. I'll leave links below. I'll leave another video here for you, and I'll see you in another one. Cheers.